Technology isn't just a part of our everyday lives anymore. It's become a frontier for global powers, with India right in the mix. So why not join the conversation? Take the Technopolitik Survey, created by researchers at the Takshashila Institution. It's just 10 simple questions, but your answers could help shape India's strategy in navigating the fast changing world of high tech geopolitics. Your voice matters, so let's make it heard. The link is in the bio.
Welcome to All Things Policy, a daily podcast by the Takshashila Institution. We are a bunch of policy nerds based in Bengaluru, and we like bringing fresh perspectives to Indian affairs and Indian perspectives to global affairs. So grab a cup of coffee, sit back, and join us for today's chat.
Hello and welcome everyone to this new episode of All Things Policy. I'm Lokendra, a research analyst with Takshashila. On 25th November 2024, there was a significant development for India's educational institutions. It is a season for one nation, one fill in the blank, right? One nation, one ration card, one nation, one election are representative of the current government's thinking. For educational institutions, in a similar fashion, on 25th November, the Government of India approved One Nation, One Subscription, or ONOS in short, as a central sector scheme. What ONOS does is that it aims to provide access to more than 13,000 journals from nearly 30 publishers, including the heavyweights such as Elsevier, Taylor and Francis, Nature, and Wiley. The government says that about 1.8 crore students from India will benefit from about 6,400 educational institutions in the country. To discuss the upsides and downsides of ONOS, I have with me today a very special guest. Shambhavi is head of research at Takshashila. She has a PhD in cancer biology and has navigated academia in the UK and in India. At the same time, she also has a significant experience in the public policy space. The idea is to leverage her academic and policy expertise to unpack the ONOS. So, Shambhavi, let me start with the first question for you. When ONOS was announced in late November, what was your initial reaction? Were you surprised or were you expecting this development to come?
I think to an extent I was expecting the development because this is not the first time that we have come across the idea of ONOS. ONOS, as I understand it, was first brought out in the new education policy. But my first reading of it was as part of the Science, Technology, Innovation Policy 2020 draft. The first chapter of that policy was on open science, and ONOS was an idea that had a paragraph dedicated to it there. My first reaction back then in 2020 was, back then it was really one nation, one subscription. The idea was not to limit it to students and to the few people who are part of the education system, but for all Indians to have access to all journals, right? That was a true vision of one nation, one subscription. This might be counted as the first step, perhaps, in that direction. My first reaction back then was, how do you do this? How is this bureaucratically a task that would be achievable, that would make sense, will not have leaks? Back then, we did not know the finances that would be entailed as part of ONOS. So we had no idea how much this would cost. There was no way to figure out what would be the benefits that we would get on this, right? So back then, my first thought was, why do we need to do this? And for a few of the Takshashila courses that were held during that time, we actually even tinkered with that idea, that if you want to achieve this, what could be the mechanisms for this? And I think one of the ideas that we had kind of put forward was a hub and spoke model. So you have a library model, and in which everybody gets email IDs and gets access via centralized libraries. And I think to a certain extent, those ideas now reflect in the updated scheme. So that's where I started from. When I came across this idea again and now, when it was passed, to be honest, I have mixed feelings, and I really don't know which way this is, because obviously on the face of it, having access to a lot of peer reviewed knowledge at I mean, it's not a nominal cost. There is still cost attached to it. But access for institutions who did not have access or the budgets to sign up for all of these really large subscriptions before is great. And it's very difficult to counter that argument that, why do you not want tier 2 and tier 3 institutions to have access, right? We do want them. The question really from a public policy analyst point of view is, what is the benefit of that over, building infrastructure in those institutions? And even bigger philosophical question for me is, when they did a press conference for this very recently as well, I remember the principal scientific advisor starting that press conference by saying that open knowledge is important. Yeah. And in that STIB 2020 chapter also, it's about open knowledge, open science. And for some, I mean, we can tease this further as we go along. But I don't think access to peer-reviewed journal articles is open knowledge. In fact, I think it buys us into this program for 3 years where we continue paying for accessing, and where, in the stage 2, etc., they also want to pay for publishing in open access, right? And I think it is counter to that philosophy of open science. And as a leader of the Global South, as a voice of the Global South, I think perhaps this wasn't the correct step at this point for India. So that's where my mixed feelings come from. On the face of it, yes, I mean, really, how can you counter giving access? But I do think there's a bigger philosophical debate to be had there.
Thanks, Shambhavi. I think your answer briefly touched on a lot of themes that we are eventually going to discuss in this podcast. But let me first ask you a follow-up on the finances part, which you briefly covered, right? So there is a very interesting blog post by Muthu Madan for London School of Economics, where Muthu has cited certain figures for the finances involved. So we know that the outlay for this scheme over the next 3 years is 6,000 crore from the government. But Muthu has also found out and cited a 2023 Lok Sabha document, right? It's I think response by some minister to some question or something, and there a figure has been provided to the in the parliament itself, which says that approximately 995 crores was spent by 10 library consortia which came together, right? So before ONOS, we had 10 library consortia coming together and having these subscriptions to all these platforms. It was a very uncoordinated sort of approach. And they were collectively spending about 995 crore, right? And it also says that over the last 3 years, the total expenditure is estimated to be nearly 2985 crore. So it's about 3,000 crores in last 3 years. But the outlay for the next 3 years is 6,000 crore. He also cites another figure where he says that it is also above other about 25% higher than the 2019 estimate given by fellows of 3 academies. Like, this figure is also cited. So based on this account, it seems that we are spending a lot of money, 6,000 crore. But when you compare it with the overall education budget, right, it is not that high. So how do you see the financial aspect of it?
Right. So let's just look at the absolute numbers for now, and we'll discuss this in context of broader education budget, right? So we do spend a lot, right? There have been different numbers floating around. There was a report that a few scientists gave, I think in the mid 2010s or something, which said that on e-journals we pay around, we as in India pays around 1,200 crores annually. On total subscriptions, around 1,500 crores, and then there's 39 crores that we pay in article processing charges, right? It is really hard how to contextualize these numbers because we don't know what is the expected outcome from those, right? Is it publications? Is it education? Is it sharing of knowledge, right? Because if it's sharing of knowledge, then we need to know how many people have actually accessed papers, how many papers have been read, and what has been the outcome of that sharing of knowledge, right? Is it people learning about scientific method? So we don't know if it's a social outcome. We don't know how to assess it really. And again, the question is, if you want to learn about the scientific method, do you need access to Nature articles? at a premium subscription, right? There are other avenues to learn about new knowledge than just peer-reviewed articles. If the outcome, like the ONOS now says, that one of the outcomes it is actively going to look for, track, is how many publications are coming out of institutions which will participate as part of ONOS, right? We don't know what that number looks like before. So it is a little difficult to judge how many more people are going to now be enrolled into the system.
But they
And
may have some number from NIRF rankings. Like they do gather certain overall ballpark numbers from institutions when they rank them, at least the
yeah,
higher education
they do, but again,
institutions.
we don't know individually institutions how many journal articles they were subscribing to and how that
Okay.
translates into publications, right?
Okay.
Now, for me, I think that even that thread is a little tenuous because A, you have to, we live in an era where a lot of papers are put up on preprint servers, for example, right?
Sure.
So making that link of, hey, I access this papers and therefore they were very important in me planning the next research that I was going to do, and from that coming up with another publication, that is a little difficult link to make. The other problem that I foresee now with ONOS to justify the budget also is they have said 3 years. And one of the things that they put out in the press release was they will monitor publications, right?
Yeah.
Now, I come from the life sciences field.
Hmm.
If I get access to a set of journal articles today, even assuming I have all the infrastructure that I really require to do cutting edge research, 3 years is not a long time, right? In life sciences, it is not a long time to be able to read papers, to be able to plan research, get all the things that I need, consumables, etc., that I need for research, and then write, hope everything goes well, that I actually get publishable data out of it and publish, right? I mean, the journal publishing times, that only is about a year and a half.
Yeah.
Right. Now, at the end of 3 years, so if you look at across various fields that ONOS is now going to is now going to target, perhaps biology might not come up with as much publications, while chemistry might.
Yeah.
Right. Hypothetically.
Yeah.
So how would you gauge that data? Right. How would you monitor that data? Is 3 years a good enough time point?
So
it is-
basically, you are talking about the measurement of the impact, right?
Yeah. So if you say that I'm going to fund so much work,
Yes.
right, and this is going to be the benefit that I'm looking from it,
Yeah.
you contextualize funding to the amount of benefits you get.
Yes. But it is unclear.
But it is
how
unclear
that
what the
would
benefits
play
are.
out.
Yeah, it is unclear what the benefits are because it's unclear. If you look only at publications, perhaps 3 years is not a good enough time point, and perhaps you need better measures also, because even at a longer time point, you will see that some fields will do better just because of their inherent nature of where they are than others.
And Shambhavi, you also made a very important qualification in your response. You said, assuming that you have access to cutting edge research facilities, infrastructure, right? One of the objectives that has been touted for this scheme has been to reach to tier 2 and tier 3 educational institutions which don't have the luxury of such subscriptions. So far only, I think IITs, IIMs, ISC and all the top research institutions in India had this access. The point is, especially in life sciences, you need a lab, right? Publications alone may help to an extent in social sciences and humanities, access to publications, right? Because a lot of theoretical work happens there. But for hard sciences, which require lab facilities, publications alone may not help. You can write review articles, right? You can just go through the last 10, 20 years of research once you have access and write nice review articles. That is possible. But we won't be able to produce profound new insights in all these cutting edge fields because in tier 2 and tier 3 cities, students simply won't have access to all these labs. So this doesn't solve the core problem facing Indian academia and educational institutions right now. That is lack of access to
it doesn't. And look, I have heard the counter argument, but that also is being done through ANRF, etc. And so we should also be doing this.
Yes.
And to an extent, that makes sense.
Makes sense, yeah.
But here's my problem with that argument, right? Every rupee that you spent on this could have been spent on building infrastructure.
Yes.
Right? And infrastructure is excludable, right? As in, if you don't have it, not much you can do about it. Knowledge, on the other hand, if you come from a tier 2 institution and you think an access to a certain paper is going to revolutionize whatever research you're going to do, you can write to the author,
Yeah.
right? All abstracts are freely available. There are very few abstracts that are not uh, shared openly, right? So if you think there is a research that makes sense in the context of what you're doing, there are multiple avenues for this, right? You can write to the authors. Most authors will happily share, maybe not the final manuscript, but they will share their drafts, they will
Yeah.
share what they have done. You can get them on a call. You don't necessarily need to read the paper to understand, right? There are other avenues for this. There are, as I said, there are these preprint servers where a
Yeah.
lot of authors do put up their papers. They talk at conferences. A
Yeah.
number of these are now available online,
Yeah.
right? So there are other avenues to actually gain knowledge, but not so much to actually get access to the infrastructure or the training that you require to perhaps do that. You use that infrastructure appropriately. And so I still go back to thinking about that for every rupee that we spend here, we are not spending that rupee on building that infrastructure, on training people, etc.
Shambhavi, your response makes me think, what if? Not just reaching out to authors themselves, because there may be some, if you're talking about tier 2, tier 3 cities, right, and academia for students. So I think there may be some mental barrier in reaching out to them via email and so on. That level of confidence and awareness may be missing. Yeah, those barriers are there. But what if, in a hypothetical scenario, Government of India decided to publicize first institute in every higher educational institution, part of these 10 consortia, which are earlier subscribing, and then institute a public facing person, right, with publicized email. And then anyone in the tier 2 and tier 3 cities, if they want to reach out to, if they want to get access to a particular paper, they can write to this nodal authority, nodal person, and they get a response back, something like that. Because I am not sure whether even the 10 consortia, what they were subscribing to, was fully utilized or not, right?
Yeah.
Because nowadays the avenues of accessing papers are multiple. It's not just you're going through your own
Yeah.
library, your own traditional methods, right? So knowledge has become more disseminated, and people in these higher education institutions are smart to figure out other ways as well. So maybe the other way to do it is to first study if the existing approach is being utilized enough. If not, and if there's some space available, then publicize nodal authorities. First, saturate the existing subscriptions to their limit
Yeah.
through this way,
Yeah.
and then maybe launch something like this when there's more demand, right?
Yeah. I mean, one of the problems when it comes to open science or open data that we, I think, in public policy also face a lot is we don't know if those negotiations have happened. We don't know if those calculations have been done, right? They might have been done. It is just that I think in the broader spirit of one nation, one subscription and open science, perhaps if that data is available, has been analyzed, it would be great to be able to see it, right? And see the justification for why this next step has come now, right? So we don't know. We don't know if this step is a natural follow-on to having done that data. Perhaps we have actually fulfilled all of our subscriptions. Who knows? So it's a little difficult to understand where India stands on that. Because we don't have the data. Again, even with the current plan, we don't know whether it is unlimited subscriptions for all the e-journals, whether there's going to be a limit of
Yeah.
subscriptions, how that's going to work. So a lot of the details we don't really know. And you're right. Perhaps the first step of bringing transparencies to how this decision was made. Right? Why this is the correct time to be looking at that data. The other thing that I was thinking when it comes to accessing knowledge is that, like you said, like all of these libraries have these. NCBS, where I used to work for before, had subscription to a certain journals. We could use those, have used set up more collaborations between tier 2 institutions and say NCBS, not just to access knowledge, but to also do the research, infrastructural access, etc. So if there are ideas that originate elsewhere, we could tie them up. The third was, so now we have currently seen that we are approaching this in multiple ways, right? We are saying we will have ANRF, which is the Anusandhan National Research Foundation, which will hopefully build infrastructure in tier 2, tier 3 cities. That's one of the goals for that. We also have a lot of these missions that are running that focus on tier 2, tier 3 cities. And now we are saying we'll do knowledge generation, knowledge access in tier 2, tier 3 cities. Perhaps the other way to look at this was identify like say 50 or 100 institutions in tier 2, tier 3 cities, and say these are going to be our focus areas for the next 10 years. This is a pot of money that will build holistically, right?
Yeah.
So right now we are just saying tier 2, tier 3.
Yeah.
This is your pot for building infrastructure. This is your pot for ONOS,
Yeah.
which means you are scattering money across too many stakeholders without a clear vision of what they're supposed to achieve. But if we had instead said that, look, we are going to target these 100 places. These are going to be the outcomes that we will look for. We'll give you 10 years, which is a sufficiently long time to actually build infrastructure and set up a research ecosystem and get it going. And here's your pot of money. Tell us what you want to do. Perhaps that might have been a more streamlined approach to getting to the same outcomes instead of saying, yeah, these are the 4, 5, or 6 tenets that we think of research ecosystem. Let us look at the tenets separately.
No, I quite agree with your assessment. I think if we would have chosen these 50 or 100 odd institutions in tier 2 and tier 3 cities and developed them holistically, right, rather than in a scattered way, we would have had possibly more better outcomes. And, as a consequence of this, it would have also reduced the pressure on higher educational institutions in India currently, right? So you would have more centers of excellence. You would have more places where aspiring students would want to go research at. You would have more publications coming out of India, more cutting edge research. It has so many benefits that flow out of a single holistic approach. So I quite agree with your assessment. Now, let me ask you around the plan itself, right? It's a long-term plan. It's not a one-off decision. And it is going to be done in a phased manner. And so the first phase is what we have seen the rollout of now. We are still yet to see, however, how it will actually pan out. But still, this is the first phase. 6,400 institutions, 2,000 crore per year, almost 1.8 crore students getting access to 13,000 journals. This is how phase 1 looks like. But now, currently in this phase, private institutions are not covered, right? So in phase 2, they plan to include private institutions as well in some public-private partnership model. And then in phase 3, they want to create universal access, which is again a very laudable goal, through designated access points in public libraries, right? This is truly democratizing knowledge production and dissemination, right? So according to what the scheme says.
I will continue to disagree that this is.
According to what the scheme says. So, what is your view on this phased plan? Do you think this is the right way to go about it?
I think if the idea was that you want to get access to everybody in India to peer-reviewed journals, yes, the phased plan makes sense. I guess I'm disagreeing with the whole idea that getting everybody in India access to peer-reviewed journal articles is open knowledge. I think that's where my fundamental disagreement is, because I think it does disservice at 2 levels, right? A, it does disservice to the fact that you're saying that you're sending a signal that peer-reviewed journal articles are perhaps a higher form of knowledge, right? And I disagree with that idea. Journal articles are important, I think, for scientists who, to signal their credibility. That is not the sole source of knowledge. And you're actually, by conflating the two, A, you are kind of questioning, I think, what previously governmental agencies have always been also trying to do. For example, Department of Biotechnology has a policy that all publicly funded data has to be made available upon publication, right? So you're supposed to set up institutional repositories and you're supposed to put out all the data that was generated using public funds. That is not really operational right now, right? And that would be open science, right? So it's data that you want to share willingly that has been generated using public funds and the public has access to it.
Yeah.
Right? Could this money have been better served if we used it to build those institutional repositories instead? Would that be more catering to open science than saying that we will look only at peer-reviewed journal articles, right? So that's one level of thing. And this flows, right? It flows into the fact that we have multiple languages. So can we use this money for scientists to build websites? And, you don't have to do peer-reviewed articles. You can just talk about your research. You can use AI tools to then use it to explain your research in different languages to different people. There have been many avenues to disseminating knowledge, which the whole idea of having peer-reviewed journal articles closes, that we could have done instead. But secondly, I think this is the point that I have been thinking about most for the past week or so. A lot of places in tier 2, tier 3 institutions do not have access to publishing as well. So perhaps the knowledge that they create is not assessed when compared to other places which have better infrastructure. Many journals might not assess that it is enough or sufficient
Yeah.
to fit into their journal scope, right? And this happens to all of us, right? A journal will say, oh, you have done all of these experiments on human cell lines, we want mouse experiments, which are like extremely expensive, require specialized training, require an animal house, all of that, which facilities which might not be easy to get access to, right? Does that make the knowledge that you have generated out of cell lines inferior? I don't think so. But it might not fit into what a journal thinks is acceptable for them. But I think that knowledge is still valuable. And what you are now saying is that for that knowledge to have value, it has to come out in a peer-reviewed paper, right? And I think it disincentivizes the whole idea that knowledge is for everybody, right? You want the tier 2, tier 3 cities, you want institutions to be talking about the work that they have done, right? And creating avenues for that instead of saying that we will cater for this age-old system which depends on us spending more money, doing more experiments. Yeah, that's where I think my fundamental disagreement with this is.
So two words that have been quite repeated in our interaction so far is open and access, right? So let's discuss the elephant in the room, so to speak, open access. And we have spoken a lot about journal articles and, so for our listeners, right? And this may not come naturally, this understanding, to those who are not in academia, to those who are in policy circles or in government or private sector, right? What are these journal articles and what are these various models of accessing and funding and so on? So there are different types of open access, right? But the traditional way we used to do journal articles is a author would submit a manuscript to a journal for assessment. The journal would first do a desk review. Then, if found to be in the scope of the journal, they will send out to peer reviewers. And they follow different sort of peer reviews, blind peer reviews, double blind peer reviews, and so on, right? So each journal will have their own way to do it, but some sort of peer review, and at least in legitimate journals, will be there. Then you get feedback, review comments, you address them, your paper is then accepted or rejected based on that by the editor. And then it goes through a process of formatting and checking and everything. And then it is finally published on the journal's website. You don't pay any money journally. But everyone who wants to read that paper has to go through a paywall. Right. So if you are an individual not affiliated with any institution, you have to pay money and a substantial amount of money to access that. And if you are an institution, right, and if you want to have access, then you have to tie up with the journal and
Pay money.
So it's a subscriber pays model. That was the traditional way. So when calls for open access started growing up, that all this knowledge is produced through mostly public funds across the world, and all the authors are doing unpaid work.
And the reviewers.
And the reviewers. Everyone is doing unpaid work. Authors are doing unpaid work. Reviewers are doing unpaid work, right?
I think the editors get paid.
Yeah. So, and they may, editors very well say they are not getting paid much also. I mean, so, and then, but the knowledge produced is behind paywalls and huge cost, right? It's not insignificant. It's quite a lot, running into sometimes I think tens of hundreds of dollars, right?
Yeah.
So that is the state that was there. So there was an increasing chorus across the world that talked about knowledge produced publicly should be publicly accessible, right?
Yeah.
Why are these gatekeepers charging so much money? And just to give an idea to our listeners, Elsevier, which is one of the biggest publishing houses in the world currently, their revenue is around $2 billion. And their profit margin is, I think the revenue is more than $2 billion, and the profit margin is close to 40%.
Yeah, 40%.
Which is This profit margin is rivaling Apple and other big tech companies, right? So that is how profitable
Yeah.
these academic publishing businesses are, which per se do not have any stake in academia. These are just businesses running the show, and there are multiple historical reasons why they are there in the first place.
Yeah.
So then what happened is a chorus came up, said, okay, open access. So then what journals did, they started doing something called hybrid open access, wherein they said if authors or their institutions pay author processing charges, which sometimes run into lakhs of Indian rupees, that is the level of
Yeah. Two
money we are
thousand
talking about.
dollars was what I was asked once to pay.
Yeah. So lakhs of rupees just for one accepted manuscript to be open access when it is published, so that it can be freely accessed by anyone, right? And open access has its benefit, right? You reach out to more people, you get more citations generally with open access. So they started saying, see, we are in favor of open access, pay us, we'll put it out for free. What this did was institutions ended up paying double, right? First, they are paying author processing charges for their authors to, get it open access, and then pay the subscription fees for the same journal as well. So
Yeah,
you're
because not all articles become open
exactly,
access, so you still have to
yeah,
pay the subscription fee for the journal
exactly,
to access all of the papers that are
yeah.
still behind
So
paywall.
hybrid was this perfect marketing ploy for the journal industry. They were like, "Oh, see, we are pro open access. We are doing this, but making double money out of it." So it was a perfect marketing profit ploy. Then certain, I think, institutions across the world came up with the idea that we can have journals which are platinum open access or diamond open access, right? So in these journals, usually there are organizations that bear the entire cost of production, entire cost involved in producing these articles, publishing these articles. They don't charge anything from the authors or the institutions, no subscription fees, no APCs, just pure open access, right? So a lot of diamond open access journals have also come about, which have been really lauded as the way to go forward for public knowledge. But the financial sustainability part of it is up for discussion. Then you have gold open access, wherein all articles are open access, but you have to pay an APC, right? So the owner shifts from subscription to authors. It is still better, I think, theoretically, than hybrid open access. Then there are others like green and bronze and so on. So, Shambhavi,
Hmm.
question for you is, should government of India, which I'm sure is aware, and the principal scientific advisor was involved in this initiative, right? And they're very competent people working in that office. They must be aware of the developments in open access movement for the last 20, 30 years. Should they have prioritized some open access arrangement instead of paying more money to Elsevier and other publishing houses?
I think we did. I think when Vijay Raghavan was the PSA, we had agreed to sign up with Plan S. I think it was called. It was a Europe-led
Yeah.
plan on open access. And then he had tweeted out that we would sign up for this, that India will participate. And then for some reason, we had withdrawn from it. And I guess the financials might not have worked out or something like that. I don't know what happened there, but we did think about this, right? But just on the evolution of access, right? I think the fundamental change that happened was we went from a print model to an online model,
Yeah.
right? And I
Yeah.
think the
Economics of it changed then, right?
yeah. Till then it made sense, right? Because the
Yeah.
journal actually was printing,
Out, yes.
sending.
Yeah.
So you had to pay a subscription
Yeah.
cost, like you pay for your newspaper, right?
Yeah.
And then we went from to online news articles, and everybody's wondering, hey, why should I pay a subscription cost, right? So I guess academia is broadly in that kind of issue right now. Obviously, the fundamental problem in the room that ONOS right now, I think in its first phase has not addressed but promises to address is this. We all agree, I think most scientists agree that science has to be open access, especially when publicly funded.
Yes.
But scientists continue to go back to journals because that it's not so
Prestige.
much because the impact factor of a
Yes.
journal, how well they are cited, etc., will impact their next grant, their next job, etc. You have to demonstrate credibility as a scientist, and most institutions around the world will ask you to show which papers have you published in
Yeah.
which journals, etc. Right? And I think most institutions will also agree that this is not the best way forward. So, for example, I might be able to publish a paper which is not of the best quality in, say, a Nature journal of a very high impact factor. That impact factor is not for my paper, right? And this has happened before. People have found flaws in papers. They have found issues with the way data was analyzed, etc., in prestigious journals as well. But by the fact that it was published in Nature, immediately it increases my prestige as a scientist, right?
Yeah.
Because that's the impact factor for the
So there's
paper.
some level of virtue signaling involved.
Yeah. And that, I mean, the publishing business has really been able to use that very effectively, right? So
Yes.
they can negotiate with authors because the entry barriers for new journals is very high,
Yeah.
right? Because it takes you a few years to be able
To make that recognition
Yeah,
and name.
and-
Yeah.
and if you don't really have the
Credible.
impact factor, no one's going to publish with
And
you
it's also a
because
business of credibility, right?
yeah.
And takes a long time for you to establish that
Yeah.
you are credible.
Yeah, so the entry barrier is quite high. No one will want to
Yeah.
publish with you because
Yeah.
you have no credibility, and you have no credibility because no one's publishing with you. And they have been able to kind of double down on that, right? I think one of the things that the ONOS press release and subsequent conferences tell us is that there is a new way to evaluate research that is under consideration. So we don't know what the details of that are, but for me, that's the most plausible way out of this cycle of trying to either fund research to be published or fund subscriptions is to create alternative ways. So if as a scientist I know that my work will not be evaluated on if I publish it on Nature or not, then I'm more likely to go the open science way. Right? If my job really depends on whether I can show that I have published in Nature, then I will do everything that I possibly can do to publish in those prestigious journals, right? Some of the funding agencies, for example, have requires Wellcome Trust requires that you publish in open access, and so they're not really that fussy about which impact factor you publish it, but they will say that all research that is created using this money has to be published in an open access way. So either they pay for the APCs, etc., or you go for an open access journal. But that's a part of the funding arrangement is already that, right? And a funding agency, I think, can make that call if they want to. But as the government, I think that signaling is really important. And of everything that I've heard about ONOS so far, it is a research evaluation framework that I'm most interested in, because for me that's the only way out of this whole publishing cycle that we are stuck in.
So, Shambhavi, your response indicates that journal articles are the only currency when it comes to academic success in academia, right?
Yeah.
The more of that currency you've accumulated, the more prestigious the currency, the more you move forward, you get promotions, you get employment at good places, and so on. So, and there is, I get your point that there's certain path dependency here, right? It's very difficult to break out of this, right? And as you said, it will take years for credible platforms to emerge. But I think one way out, potentially, might be that organizations which are publicly funded, right? They can promote, first establish certain diamond open access journals, fund them. It won't take a lot of money, fund them. And when they associate the name of their institution or organization with that particular journal, right, some credibility comes with it, right? For instance, if tomorrow, let's say, IIT Bombay were to say, okay, these are our 2 or 3 journals in these 3 fields, um, diamond open access, and we are behind this initiative, right? So I think that would signal some level of credibility. And it can also say we encourage IITs in India and researchers at IITs to publish in these, and you can start with that. So maybe organizations across the world can do that. Maybe we can borrow something from the foundation model in open source. Open source is slightly different from open access, but in open source, what we are seeing is certain foundations have come up. For instance, Signal, right? So there's a foundation backing it, and you have an open source product, right? So some foundations can come up which can actually establish such open access journals and attach their name to them and signal virtue signal or signal credibility. This may take few years to materialize. But I think if India has aspirations to become an R&D powerhouse in the next 10, 20 years, right, it has to take a long-term strategy. My view is that, okay, 2000 crore per year is not a big sum of money when you stack it up against the entire educational budget, or when you stack it up against India's GDP or the government expenses and so on. It is not that significant. We can argue about the merits and demerits of it, or how much we can do a cost benefit analysis. And again, the metrics are not very clear, right? How will you evaluate it? But still, it is not a very significant money. But I think it really doesn't solve the problem of infrastructure, and also doesn't solve the problem you spoke about, right? How do people in tier 2 and tier 3 cities produce knowledge when they don't have access to the tools and expertise required to do so, and the guidance required to do so? And the labs, right? You spoke about human mice and the conditions imposed by journals, right? So if India has to take a long-term view, then it has to invest in infrastructure, take a holistic approach, as you said, in tier 2 and tier 3 cities, and also think about how do we make knowledge dissemination, distribution in India more openly available in a manner that doesn't promote already dominant industries, right? Globally, like the 30 odd publishers we are signed up with, they're hugely profitable. So how do we do that? I think that is going to be the key.
Let me add a couple of points here. So, I had written this piece for the Hindu a few years ago, I think, last year, in which I had said that, we need the science academies of India to do better, right? The foundations that you just spoke about, the institutions. This is a role that the science academies really need to play. Now, the science academies do have journals. Nobody's publishing there, right? And they're also underfunded, and there are a host of other problems. But the science academies are a great place because it is not, you cannot really be. If IIT Bombay has a journal, then you could say that, hey, they might prefer their own researchers to publish there, right? The science academies do not really have that kind of biases, should not really have that kind of biases in them, right? I think, and we have three of them. We have three science academies. So between them, they should be able to, I think, figure out an alternative way of publishing that makes sense in the Indian scenario, as well as really work their journals, make them attractive enough for people within India to at least publish that. But we have really not seen that take off as extensively as you would have liked to.
I think there's a way you can incentivize that. Like you spoke about, you welcome trust, right? Saying that we need publications in open access. Maybe Indian institutions can say, like the UGC mandates certain requirements out of PhDs. Maybe institutions can say, okay, we mandate that for promotion from assistant professorship to associate and so on, or for PhDs, we need at least one publication in an open access journal in India, right? Something like that. You incentivize that. Maybe not make it mandatory, but incentivize it in some way.
You just said make it mandatory, and then you said
no. Sorry, I realized making it mandatory will have its own unintended consequences.
So
yes.
It will be problematic.
It will be problematic. But incentivize, nudge, right? Nudge and incentivize in some way, which is not very nefarious, right?
But it is difficult, and I know this personally as well because I am an assistant editor on the Dialogue Journal, which the Indian Academy of Sciences run. And we've been trying to get people to write for us, right? And this is an open call. If you're interested, if you work on sciences, both hard sciences as well as on policy, and if you would like to write for the Indian Academy of Sciences Dialogue Journal, please reach out to us. We need to be able to, publish and run more through the sciences, where it is very difficult to get this. That makes things difficult. The other thing I wanted to talk about briefly before we stop is peer-reviewed journal articles are not the easiest to read, right?
Yes.
When I first heard about this idea that all the Indians should have access to peer-reviewed journal articles, I was like, I struggle with, I have a PhD and I struggled sometimes with understanding the language. I can definitely, for a lot of methods that we read, we feel that we need to get out to the authors because we have no idea what has happened and how they have done a particular technique that they have said. And especially when you say that, oh, look, we are going to look at prestigious journals.
Yeah.
You come with this bias that because something is published in a prestigious journal, it has to be good and credible.
Yeah.
And it is often not. right? We have found this, right? We have found retractions.
Yeah.
We have found that the peer
There
review
are
process
certain
can
initiatives like Retraction Watch that
be,
have
there's
come up to.
peer. So again, even that peer review process is now being slowly outsourced because it's anyways free for the journals. We are seeing online comments come in. So there's a lot of digitization that has come into the different aspects that the journals continue to offer. The point that I was trying to make is when you say that these things are going to be available, there's also responsibility to make sure that the people who are reading it have the training to understand
Yeah.
and use it.
Yeah.
Right? And that is a piece that I find missing as part of ONOS. Is great you are making it available, but in terms of language, in terms of technique, in terms of appreciating how to question that science as well, that methodology, is that part of ONOS? Because without that, we are just simply saying that, hey, read. Right? Here, you have access, you can read. But how to take that and run with it, or how to take that, question it and say, hey, this might be wrong. Let me try to figure out another way. That is part of training that is very important.
Yeah.
And without that, just giving access isn't helpful. So again, I mean, on the face of it, really nice idea.
Yeah.
But do we have all the parts in place? There are other parts that need to be put in place before you bring this on. That's the question we have to ask.
So, I mean, that's a very profound and important question to actually end the podcast with. So, I do encourage our listeners to think about the parting question Shambhavi has posed, right? If you don't have other components in place in India's educational machinery, how to interpret, how to access, how to read these journal articles. And then Shambhavi also spoke about how do you actually publish something, right? Do you have access to guidance and resources that train you how to write? Do you have access to infrastructure? So these are, I think, three basic components you have spoken about. She has also spoken about a holistic approach to education institutions in Tier 2 and Tier 3 cities. So we'll leave you with these profound thoughts and questions. And please do reach out to us at Takshashila if you have your thoughts and responses on these. Thank you so much for listening today.
Thank you.
If you liked our show, dive into Takshashila's research on technology, strategy, and economic affairs. Check us out at our Twitter handle at Takshashila INST or our website takshashila.org.in.